I have my Bible and I have my tissues. Do you guys have yours? You might need both tonight. For those of you guys that don't know, there's like a running joke. I can't not cry. Like we could talk about literally like the dumbest thing and I will cry. So I'm prepared this time, but I want to get us started on something out of the series that we've been doing. We're taking a step out. We've been in 1 Corinthians for a while, but now until Easter, we're going to step out and we're just going to talk a little bit more specifically about Jesus. And so to get us started tonight, let me check with you guys and make sure that I'm not the only one. Have you guys ever been desperate for God to answer your prayers? You ever had those moments, right? And I'm hoping that you're praying on a regular basis. I'm hoping that it's a communication with God that's kind of ongoing, but there are some prayers that sort of rise to the top, am I right? There are moments that aren't the everyday prayers. They're the gut-wrenching, bare your soul, flat on your face admission that like, I can't solve this, whatever it is, right? That I need you, God, to come through. I'm desperate. You guys have had some prayers like that, right? Fairly recently, Christy and I had a ministry opportunity that just came up out of the blue. We weren't looking for it. We just kind of got a phone call, kind of out of nowhere. Have you guys ever been blindsided by something that could dramatically change your life? Have you ever had something that you really didn't see coming, and then it just shows up? And it's the kind of thing that, like, if it happens, it's going to change everything. That's what this was for us. We were kind of caught off guard by it. And on one hand, my first thought was there's so much at stake in a decision like this. Right? Like, I still have kids in my home, and I love my life. I love this ministry. Like, there's so many things at stake, so many things that matter to my life the way that it is. But then, have you ever, in those moments where you didn't see it coming, just a little bit, you start to dream? You just start asking, like, well, what if? What if this is God that's taking me here? What would happen if? And you let yourself dream just a little bit. And Christy and I found ourselves in that moment where we were balancing between what is at stake, and at the same time, what if? What if God was calling us to this next step? What might it look like? And what was hard was the decision needed to be made incredibly fast. We were presented with it, and from the moment we were presented with this idea, we had 2 months to decide if we were going to change our entire life. Was this something that God wanted us to do? You can imagine the pressure in that moment. We have such a short period of time for such a big decision. What was God doing? And I remember asking, God, if you really want this to happen, you're going to need to give me a picture of what it would look like. Who's going to be involved? Do I know anybody else that's going to be there? Where is the money going to work out? Like, I'm leaving a real, like, just a job and a ministry, and could you show me what it would look like? I remember praying more in that season than I've prayed in a long time because I was just desperate, right? Now, in the end, I felt like that wasn't what God wanted. This is what God wanted, right? But in those moments of trying to figure it out, I remember the desperation of being up all night. I remember thinking about it at random times during the day when I shouldn't be. I should be focused on something else. Right? And I know that you guys have had moments where you're desperate with the Lord too. Right? And maybe it's like that. Maybe it's a life-changing decision that you're wrestling with. But that's not the only time that we're desperate either. Maybe you're more like some of my friends' experiences. I was just kind of racking my brain on what this looks like. And this week I had a conversation with a friend who had to have a hard conversation with her superiors. And she was sick to her stomach, right? It kept her up. She was praying more in those moments, the car ride coming and going, than she was normally because it was such a big deal. It was about protecting somebody else, and then she knew it might not go well, and what if? And you start having all those questions, like what if? What if? Do you guys ever have those moments where something, even a conversation, can feel bigger? And so the what if questions start spinning in your head. Or maybe you're like some other friends of mine that have had the most horrible year and the most amazing year because their daughter was born last year, but she spent more time in the hospital than she did at home. Right? And the crazy night whenever you think everything's okay and you're fast asleep, but your head pops off the pillow and you have to go check because you never know. And then a trip to the ER takes you to Denver and you spend more weeks in the hospital again, time after time. There are moments that push us to desperation. And we pray different in those moments, don't we? Doesn't it seem like our prayers get a little bit more serious when we're desperate? And there are some prayers that are just bigger deals than others. We desperately need God to show up. What I love about Jesus is that he knows how that feels too. That Jesus himself knows what it's like to be desperate before the Father, to need an answer, to have no other options, and to call out in desperation. Even in Jesus' life, there were moments that rose above the rest. What I want to do tonight is I want to look at one of those moments. And it's not going to be a surprise to you that we're talking about the Garden of Gethsemane. We're talking about a moment near the end of Jesus' life where he had just had the Last Supper with his friends and he had just predicted Peter's denial and he had just sent Judas off to do what Judas was about to do. And they leave that meal in the night and they walk to a hill that looks over Jerusalem. And in Matthew 26, it goes like this. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, and he took them along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here. Keep watch with me." I can't help when I'm reading that passage but see the humanity of Jesus. Right? We talk a lot about Jesus is God. He's the Son of God. We try to explain the Trinity. And we have all of this theology about his godness. But it's in stories like this that I'm reminded that he's a lot more like me than I think. Right? And so what I love here is he gets his best friends, Peter, James, and John. Now, he's got the bigger crew, 12 guys, and they're kind of like like a Boy Scout troop. Like they go together, right? They go camp together, and then they go minister together, and they do all the things together. But out of them, he's got his friends. Peter, James, and John are the ones he's close to. And so while he takes the whole troop and he says, "I need you guys to be near me. Come hang out with me. We're going to the garden." But when he gets there, he's like, "Hey, you guys, would you come here for a minute?" And then it's almost like he tells them a secret. It's almost like he has a moment when he just needs people to confide in. Do you remember the first time that you saw your mom or dad really shaken? Those of you that have experienced it, maybe for the first time you saw your dad cry, or you saw your parents so worried that they were visibly upset. Do you remember what that did to you? Right? How that changed the way that you saw them, that changed the way that you saw the moment, and suddenly you're like hyper aware. This could be something serious right now. Right? And so he takes them aside and he says something to them that if I were one of those guys would have shaken me to my core. He says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Can you imagine hearing that for a second? Imagine being Peter and the same guy that spoke into a storm and said to the waves that were terrifying the fishermen, "Be calm." And they just do. They just stop. Right? Or he says to Lazarus after he's dead, "Come out of the grave," and the man walks out. Like, these guys had witnessed Jesus with that kind of authority over nature and over life. Imagine your master, your teacher, the guy that he's always got the right answers. He always knows he's so steady. Imagine hearing him say, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow. To the point I feel like I'm going to die. It's to the point of death. So overwhelmed." Now, think about it from Jesus' point of view, though, too. Think about what it means when Jesus says, "my soul." The eternal soul of the Son, who had experienced the joy of creation. He had experienced the anguish of the fall of man in the garden. He watches with frustration while Satan influences the world all throughout history. That soul says, "I'm overwhelmed. It's almost too much pressure for me." To the point that it feels like I'm dying. What was it that was that big of a deal for Jesus? What was it that was so hard? Again, I can't help but see the humanity of Jesus, because he knew it was his death right around the corner. In his humanity, he left heaven and he came to earth and he put on humanity that he would experience what we would experience. And in that moment, he looked forward and he said, "I see it coming." But he also knew what was about to happen in a cosmic sense. That the judgment and the condemnation of all sin for all time was about to be put on his soul. That the Father would have to treat him like he treats sinners, so that he could treat us sinners the way that he treats the Son. There was a trade, and we benefit from the fun end of that trade, but Jesus was looking at the other end of it. He knew what that meant. Have you ever been so overwhelmed with your own guilt? Right? You've done something so bad, or you're confronted with it and you didn't know it was bad, and then it hits you and you're like, "Oh my gosh, that's one." There are 8 billion people on the planet just right now. Imagine how many other people have all existed, and for all of that weight to be on just Jesus. It makes sense that he's overwhelmed, right? Told you. All right, let's keep going. Verse 39 says that going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and he prayed, "My Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me. Is there any other way? I don't want to do this." Now that's hard to hear, right? That Jesus would have that thought, right? Like, I want out. I don't want to do this. Is there any other option? That's Matthew's version. Let's look at it in Mark. Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and he prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me." Now here it says, Abba, Father. That's two different languages. You have Aramaic, Abba, and then we are translating the Greek Father into English, right? So Father, Father is what it's saying. Two different languages. But the Abba part, the Aramaic part, imagine the intimate appeal of a child to a father when he says, "Dad." Right? Like when your child comes running up to you like, "Dad, can I have this? Dad, I've missed you all day long. Dad." It's like Jesus is looking into the throne room of heaven, and he's not just saying Father, the title of our relationship. It's that intimate Dad. And then he says, "I know everything is possible for you. I know who you are. Take this cup from me, Dad." See, he knows what's going to happen, and he wants out. Think about that for a moment. But he knows he probably helped make the plan. Like if we're going to imagine what the Trinity meeting was like before Jesus came to earth, they were like, okay, you're going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. And they're it's not like it was a shock, right? Do you know what it's like to know something is coming, and then the day that it gets there, you get that lump in your throat? Do you know that feeling? Right? And it could be good or bad. You could be playing a basketball game, and it's the biggest basketball game of the season, and you've known it was on the calendar all year, but when it's game time, you feel it. Or it could be that conversation that you have been putting off, and it eventually finds its way onto your schedule. He knows what's going to happen. The Luke version of this adds a detail too. In Luke 22, it says, an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, this could mean that he just literally had so much sweat that it was dripping and dropping onto the ground the way that blood coming out of a wound would, like actual liquid. But there is actually a condition where certain people, if they strain hard enough, they pop blood vessels that are so close to the sweat glands that it actually mixes and you end up with bloody sweat. So that it kind of doesn't matter, right? The point here is that he's talking about it was such an intense moment that it was like he was sweating blood. Have you guys ever seen a pro athlete that was so intense? They're going so hard and they're just drenched, right? But they're unaware of the impact of they're all sweaty, they're a mess, they're disheveled. It doesn't matter because they're so focused. And it's Jesus is so focused here. See, Jesus knows what you're feeling when you're desperate for God to answer your prayers. Jesus is hyper aware of what that desperation feels like. If we continued in Luke, it would say in verse 45, when he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. Why are you sleeping? He asked. Get up and pray so that you won't fall into temptation. I have always thought that when he comes back, it's this disappointing moment where these guys aren't taking it seriously and they're just taking a nap. I've always been disappointed with these guys, and then I reread it. They were exhausted from sorrow. This was going to be life-changing for everybody, right? And they were rattled because he was rattled. They didn't know what was going on. Right? But they knew that the guy that does know what's going on is pretty upset. And so they're upset, they're worried, and they just got worn out before he did. This is the kind of thing that's going to change lives. Now, if we zoom back out of that for a second, and we just talk about being desperate for God to answer our prayers. If we dug a little bit under that idea, that statement that we're desperate for God to answer our prayers, what we actually mean is that we're desperate for God to do our will. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Jesus did it, right? We have a good example in front of us, but the reality is our desperation is that attempt to convince God how serious we are about what we want done, what we need to happen. So what happens when God doesn't answer our prayers? What do? What happens when God doesn't answer? Can I fix something really quick just as a little pause, like a sidebar? We have a problem in the way that we speak to each other in church culture because we say that God answered my prayers when we get a yes from God. But he answers prayers other ways. I even find that happening in my group chats and stuff. We're saying oh, hallelujah, answered prayers. And yes, it was an answered prayer, but you realize he could have answered with something else. But we act like, and it's not just the way we speak, we also act like God either says yes or he hasn't answered it yet. How does God answer prayers? He says yes. He says no. He says not yet sometimes. There's even some obscure scriptures that say that he goes, I'm not listening to you, like, nah, like not until you deal with this, right? He tells, in 2 Peter, he tells us that if you treat your wife harshly, then God doesn't hear your prayers. It's like he's going, not till we fix that, right? But mostly he says yes, he says no, or he says not yet. Those are the common things. And here's the ugly side of that. I think all of us in here would be like, yeah, of course, God says yes, and he says no. I get it. When we hear no, we assume that it could have been a yes if, fill in the blank. Right? It could have been a yes if I would have been more qualified for a yes. Right? We often think that we're not qualified. Like, I need to clean up my life a little bit. I could see why he wouldn't say yes to that, right? Like, I feel this way sometimes. Have you ever noticed, I feel guilty whenever I'm praying for something and I know good and well that I'm not trying that hard on the back end. And I'm like, I'd say no to God. It's okay. But we think that we don't qualify. Maybe we haven't put in enough faith effort, right? Or we haven't been consistent enough. Whatever it is, it's like, well, yeah, he said no, but he probably would have said yes if. Or we say that God's saying no because he's got a better yes for you. Right? And maybe your favorite preacher has said that to you with the organ playing in the background, and they're like jumping and like, God's got a better yes. Listen, God might have a better yes, right? But we take moments like that where we hear a little bit of truth and we turn it into a rule that God has to follow, that like there isn't room in our mind for a no. That a no always has a reason. Either I need to get better at something or he's got another plan. I'm afraid that we don't actually have a category for no as an answer from God. And so what I want to share with you guys is something that I read a year or so ago, and it has just been tumbling around in my mind. It's been so impactful for me that I've been waiting to preach on it because I wanted it to be just right. And it comes out of the book of Hebrews. And it's a commentary on the Garden of Gethsemane moment. In Hebrews 5, it starts out talking about how we have such a great high priest who sympathizes with our weakness. So, of course, it's talking about his humanity. And then we get to verse 7, Hebrews 5:7. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, and it goes on to explain how he didn't get what he wanted. Now, pause for a minute. I have a hard time thinking that God might tell me no, and you're telling me that Jesus, the Son of God, got a no? Right? And I have this idea in my mind that I would have gotten a yes if I would have been more qualified. And yet I look at this, and I imagine like Jesus walking into the bank, right? And he's like applying for a mortgage. He wants something, and there's like a checklist. Like, how qualified are you? And what I like here is we see a pretty good list. See, he didn't try to solve it himself, like a lot of us do whenever we have a problem, right? It's like, check. Good job, Jesus. You're trusting the right person. And he was serious, right? Like it says that he had fervent cries and tears here. We know that he was so upset that he was sweating blood. Like he put all of his willpower into praying and trusting God. Okay, check. Took it serious. He prayed to the right God. That's important, right? He actually knows God is the one who can save me. My Father is the answer. There's not another option. He had faith based on the truth, check. And God heard him. Now, how many of you have ever felt like you prayed and it's like hitting a ceiling? Right? Like it's not getting through. Maybe God's not listening, right? And you think maybe it's something in my life that's keeping him from hearing me, or he's too busy. There's a lot of people. This might not be a big deal. You just feel like it's just going into the ether. And this says, no, the Father heard him. In fact, he heard him specifically, it says, because he was reverent and submitted. So his heart was right. He put himself in the right place under God's authority. And he's the Son. He left the throne room of heaven. He owns the bank. And he's applying at the bank that he owns. Nobody was ever more qualified to get a yes from the Father than Jesus, the Son. He did everything right. And he was exactly who he was supposed to be. And yet God got out his stamp and said, denied. No. The Father told the Son, no. Not because he was disqualified from it, and not because he had something better for him around the corner. Do you know what was around the corner? The cross was around the corner. There wasn't a better plan. There wasn't another way out. There wasn't something that was really going to make it satisfying that like, oh, I heard no here, but it was worth it. It was just no. And there's a problem. I don't think that we're prepared for God to say no to us. For him to say, I'm going to let this happen. I'm not going to stop it. The path that I have chosen for you, son, includes suffering. See, not every no is because you're not qualified or because he has something better for you around the corner. Sometimes he's just saying, no, I want you to go through this. And we protest. We say, but I don't want to go through this. It sucks. Have you actually looked at what you're going to make me do? I have some other good options. Have you even looked? I've got a spreadsheet, things we could do. Why is it this one, right? Or we're just honest, like, God, I'm so desperate. Please, please. Or sometimes our protests remind him of how faithful we've been. But God, I've been putting in the work. But God, I've been doing the things that you've been asking me to do. It's like this whole thing is based on some credit score, and we go, of course I wouldn't get approved whenever I had a 400 credit score, but my heavenly credit score now is like 745. I should qualify for this. Like, I've been putting in the effort. I've been putting in the work. Why? I've been so faithful. See, and what this tells me, when we have that protest in our heart, what that tells me is that we have created a contract with God where no isn't part of the deal. We've created an unsaid and unspoken contract between us and him. Like if I give up my boys' trip and I stop going to the bar after work on Fridays, and if I take my wife out every week and make sure that she's loved and taken care of, and if I stop and ask God what he wants me to do in this next season, and then I go and I worship and I mean it and I feel tingly at church, if my credit score gets high enough, I should get what I pray for. I should get what I want too, right? I think we've accidentally created a contract with God that he didn't sign. And most of us don't even realize that it's just happened on accident. It snuck up on us, right? And what we end up feeling, we would never say it, but what we end up feeling is, I will work to be what you want me to be, and you're going to give me the things that I want out of life. See, the problem is the output of that contract is conditional obedience. I'll submit, I'll obey, I'll change, and you'll bless me, and you'll protect me, and you'll keep me safe. I'll obey, and you'll help. But pretty soon it turns into, I'll obey if you help. And then it's not too much further than that for us to justify our disobedience because he broke the contract that he never signed. Well, you never followed through on your part. Because we have started from this place that we're not ready for God to just say no to something. And so, this idea that if I'm obedient, I won't have to suffer. If I'm obedient, things will go well for me. That is not what happened to Jesus. There is a connection between obedience and suffering, but it's not the one you think. See, the rest of that verse in Hebrews 5 says, son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. Think about that for a second. Jesus became obedient when he submitted to the very thing that he wanted to avoid. That's when he learned obedience. That's when he became obedient. In fact, in Philippians 2, it says, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. When God said no to Jesus, it meant the cross. When God said no to Jesus, it meant being arrested for no crime whatsoever. It meant being abandoned by his friends and his followers. It meant being rejected by the religious leaders who claimed to worship his Father. It meant being beaten within moments of death. It meant being humiliated and stripped and nailed to a cross and stood up and having to choose between the agony of the pain of pulling himself up or suffocating, because those were his options. When God said no to Jesus, it meant the cross, but that wasn't even the worst part. It meant that the Father himself was going to have to turn his face on his Son in judgment as he absorbed the weight and the guilt of all of us. Jesus became obedient by submitting to the very thing that he wanted to avoid. Obedience doesn't count for much when it's easy. The other day I gave Joseph $20, and they can all drive now, which, by the way, parents, that's the light at the end of the tunnel. They can all drive. My youngest, I gave him a $20 bill, and I said, go get us some ice cream. You pick the flavor, keep the change. And he did it. Aren't you guys proud? He was obedient. Of course he was obedient, right? Like when you ask God to deliver you from a soul-sucking job and he brings a great opportunity your way and he says it's time to move on and you do it, good. Like, good job. I'm glad you obeyed. When you find a bonus $20 bill in your laundry, have you ever done that? You're like putting your laundry away and you're like, money, bonus money. You find a bonus $20 bill, but then later that day, it's like the Holy Spirit says that lady on the corner needs $20. And you're like, all right, I didn't even know I had it in the first place. Good job. Glad you were obedient. But the true test of the limits of our obedience comes when we don't benefit from it. The true test of obedience is whether or not we will obey when it hurts us, when it's hard, when we get nothing out of it, when it's something that we would rather avoid. And see, it wasn't just that Jesus went through this suffering even whenever he wanted out. It's how he went through it that matters. See, back in Mark 14, one of those examples from the Gospels, We ended that just a little bit early. It says, going a little farther, he fell to the ground and he prayed, if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. Not my will, though, but what you will. Yet not my will be done here, yours. Jesus was desperate for another way, but even deeper than his desperation was his resolve to pursue the Father's will over his own. Jesus became obedient by doing what he didn't want to do, knowing that he was qualified, knowing that God heard him, knowing that he was the son of that very throne room. Jesus became obedient, doing what he didn't want to do because there were no conditions for his obedience. And remember, I think that we have a tendency to write a contract with God that says, I'll obey if you bless and protect me. We create conditions for our obedience. And so as we get close to the end here, I'm going to invite Pastor Tim to come back up. We're going to do things a little bit differently as we get close to the finish line here. We create conditions for our own obedience. And what ends up happening there is that we justify our disobedience when our conditions aren't met in the first place. I don't know if you guys have ever had that conversation when you say, yeah, I would, but. Yeah, I'll get to that when he stops fill in the blank, right? And I know for me, I told you earlier about that ministry opportunity. Can I be honest about how sneaky this is? That these conditions sneak into our mind? In the end, we did feel like God wanted us to stay here, and I've had it confirmed over and over. I feel like we are listening to the Lord, and I also realize that whenever I'm looking back at that season, even though I genuinely wanted to know what God's will was, I had woven in a bunch of little conditions. Well, if the money's just right, I'll do it. Well, if I know some people that are there, if I feel comfortable, if I can be guaranteed that whenever I do it, it won't hurt my kids. If and when my conditions are met, that's where my heart was at. And I would battle back and forth. And I'd have to remind myself that I want God's will. And then it would sneak in again. It was so sneaky. And my guess is that if I'm dealing with that I'm not the only one here. Even when you have good intentions and you actually want to know what God wants, those little threads of conditional obedience find their way in. And you end up giving yourself an excuse when you don't obey. It's like a back door. I'll obey. Oh, I'm not going to actually because you understand, right? And we get ourselves off the hook. Right? I know that I find myself sometimes saying that I really would do that, God. I agree. That is the right thing to do. I'll get to it. I got some other things that are heavy. I got some other things that I need to deal with because that's so heavy. And I'm justifying my disobedience because my conditions aren't perfectly met yet. And I don't know about you, but if I asked you, where do you justify your disobedience? Is there anywhere that you justify your own sin because your conditions aren't met? So you're not bothered. You know you shouldn't flirt with that guy at the office, but you've prayed and prayed and prayed for your husband to change and he just isn't changing. Or you've been hurt so badly by somebody that you just refuse to give up. You know what God says, but you refuse. You hold on to that bitterness. It's your right. Where do you find yourself saying, I would do that if. I would do that, but this needs to move first. I'm going to leave you with a simple phrase on the screen. Conditional obedience is disobedience. There's no other way around it. 90% obedience is disobedience. 99% obedience is disobedience. If there are conditions that make you feel like you don't have to obey, you're doing it wrong. Now, there's nothing wrong with being desperate and crying before God for him to see things our way, but at the end of the day, we are called to trust him and see things his way. We bring our desperation before him, but look at how quickly Jesus said, I want out, but I want your will more. And you might say, I need you to solve this, but I need you more. I need your will more. And I'm afraid that far too often my lips would say, not my will, but yours, while my heart is saying, not your will, but mine. How often inside of us are we so consumed with what we want that we give ourselves a pass on what God wants? What we're going to do is we're going to take a few moments, and if you know the words, you can sing along with Tim, and then I'm going to come back up and I'm going to close this a little bit differently this evening.